We're going to be looking at several scriptures this morning, but our text is going to be from Genesis, the first book of the Bible, chapter 45. Genesis chapter 45 this morning. You also have a copy of the scriptures on your handout. Genesis chapter 45. Let me remind you, this is the second part of our series of what we're calling the fourth quarter. And it all has to do, the fourth quarter has to do with how we finish life. How we finish in our life. I mean, let's face it. If you take certain areas of your life, or in the past, and if you was to be honest this morning, you could say, I blew it. I really blew it. And we either did something or we said something that maybe in the past that still haunts our memory. Maybe it haunts us occasionally, maybe even frequently. It's something we did or said that it just drives us crazy that it still is in our mind. It's like being involved in a football game and you've totally messed up for the first 3 quarters. And then all of a sudden, you have the fourth quarter. And that's the good part about it is, now all you can do is put the first 3 quarters behind you and concentrate on the fourth quarter. In other words, you know what? I've got off to a bad start, but I'm not finished yet. Just think about what all these could relate to in life. I mean, think about it for a minute. Let's just say you got off to a rocky start in your marriage. Maybe for months, maybe for years. Well, how are you going to play the fourth quarter? What are you going to do to change that rocky marriage? What about the job factor? Let's just say you got laid off. You got fired. Maybe it was not your fault. Maybe it was your fault. Maybe you deserved it. The question is, are you still willing to go out in the fourth quarter and play? How about if you're one of those that have just lived a life that has gotten bad breaks? You know, it's just been one thing after another. You know, going back, your childhood was not good. You didn't have a good childhood at all. You got to your teenage years and they were just miserable. And then once you became an adult, there was just a cloud of darkness and misery that just followed you. And if you continue in this mindset about living in the past, you'll miss out on the fourth quarter. You see, that's what it's all about. We've all had some shaky areas in our life. We've all had some bad spots. We've all had some gloomy days. We've all had some barriers in the road that has tried to block us. But in the end, how are we going to finish? You know, one of the most heartfelt stories in the Bible comes from a man by the name of Joseph. Joseph was the son of Jacob. Jacob was the son of Isaac. Isaac was the son of Abraham. So I guess if you put all that together, I think that makes Joseph the great-great-grandson of Abraham. Something like that. But anyway, they were all related. And his favorite, Jacob had many kids, but his favorite was Joseph. Joseph was his favorite child. And despite his siblings, his brothers, because they felt totally different, Joseph was a man of God. He was full of faith. But if you was to sum up the life of his father Jacob and his family life growing up, one word could describe it. Drama. Drama. Because that's the only word that would come to mind when you read the story about Joseph or about Jacob and the family. Is drama. It was always surrounded by drama. People backstabbing one another. Family members backstabbing one another. Just always drama in the family. And what I want to share with you this morning is something that is vitally important to finishing strong. And that is the word forgiveness. Forgiveness. And this, if we're going to finish strong in our spiritual life, and one day we're going to to stand before the Almighty God and give an account for what we did in our lives. If you're a believer, you're going to have reservations in heaven, but you're still going to have to give an account of what you did in your life when you lived for Jesus. So the question is, maybe you're here this morning and you have not did real well in the first 3 quarters. How are you going to finish? What are you going to do in the 4th quarter? When the hands start going up and you start seeing the 4th quarter, what are we going to do? You might say, well, I just can't catch a break. Let's throw away the excuses. And let's see if we can finish strong in the 4th quarter. Let me share 3 things with you this morning about forgiveness. Okay? Number 1, forgiveness is not forgetting, it's just moving forward. Number 1, forgiveness is not forgetting, it's just moving forward. I don't know how many here are familiar with the story of Joseph, but let me give you a quick summary or overview about his life. Somewhere around the age of 17, we pick up the story about Joseph quite a bit in his life. Joseph was hated by his brothers. He was adored by his father. And it showed. It actually showed how he favored him. But God gave Joseph a gift. And that gift was to interpret dreams. Now understand, the Bible has not been completed at this time, and God spoke in a variety of different ways in the Old Testament and New Testament. Oftentimes He would speak by angels. Sometimes God would speak audibly. Sometimes God would speak through dreams. Sometimes through angels. In all different ways. The primary way of how God speaks today is through His Word. We have the beginning, we have the present, we have the end. You want to know what's going to happen at the end time? Jesus is coming back. Those are saved are going to heaven. Those are not going to spend eternity in hell. Okay? You want to know, 80% of the New Testament is about how to live the Christian life. 20% is showing us how we can be saved. The Old Testament is there for our examples, but the truth of it still applies to us today. If you was to sum up the Bible, it could be summed up as God's love for mankind. But God gave Joseph a gift, just like He gives you and I a gift or gifts. And somewhere around age 17, Joseph began to tell his brothers about a dream he had. Now keep in mind, his brothers hated him and despised him. So he goes and tells his brother this dream. And his brothers did not like the dream. Because the dream was this. One day, you guys are going to bow down to baby brother. And not only that, Mom and Dad's going to bow down to baby brother. So needless to say, that didn't sit well. Okay? That created a dislike for Joseph into probably what we could call the word hatred. Now, needless to say, Joseph was Daddy's favorite. There was no doubt about it. And like I said, there was that strong dislike had turned into hatred. But one day while they were out in the field, Joseph's brothers was out there, and Joseph went out there to check on them. And they decided to plot a scheme. And they said, let's throw him in this pit, and let's kill him. One of the brothers spoke up and said, no, let's don't kill him, let's just throw him in the pit. And they threw him in the pit. And they were scheming in their minds what they were going to do. They were going to go home and tell their daddy that their younger brother had died in the woods. And all they found was his jacket, his coat, and they were going to smear blood on it to show the daddy. But as they threw him in the pit, and as they took time for lunch and all like this, a group called the Ishmaelites came by. And they said, we'll buy the boy from you. And they sold him. Now keep in mind, he's 17 years old, and he was sold into slavery. He was sold like a piece of trash. He was sold, and his brothers sold him, and they went home, and they told their daddy that the younger brother had been killed. But the truth of the matter is, those brothers sold him into slavery. As time passed on, this group called the Ishmaelites sold him to a man that is known as Potiphar. Potiphar was a commanding officer of the Egyptian army. And Potiphar had a nice place and all like this, and Joseph had really earned his trust. In fact, he earned his trust so much he was like his right-hand man. And he said, Joseph, he said, I'm putting you in charge of everything in my household. You're in charge. I mean, you're my main man here. You're my butler. You're everything. I'm putting you in charge. The problem was, evidently, Joseph was one good-looking man. And Joseph, I guess if Elvis Presley was here, he'd say the hunk of Hebrew. You know? Something like that. Thank you very much. I mean, he was something. And Potiphar's wife decided that she wanted to have sexual relations with Joseph. Joseph refused her. And one day, she grabbed Joseph by his garment, and he took off, and he fled, and he ran. Once again, just like the brothers, the wife of Potiphar concocted a story of a bunch of lies and said, the hunk of Hebrew tried to rape me. Now, back then, you was sentenced to death for something like that. But for some reason, Joseph wasn't. I don't know if her husband kind of believed Joseph or what. But instead, he threw him into prison. Now the interesting part, things are just, now remember, he's at the age of 17 and he's growing older during all this time. But in prison, he became the focus of attention. He was liked by the prison guards, the keepers of the prisons. They really, really liked Joseph a lot, even though he was a prisoner. His cohorts, the people that he was in prison with, had a lot of respect for this man. And later, they found out that he could interpret dreams. Now, you had what they called Potiphar, who was the chief commanding officer here. But then you had another man that was in charge of Egypt called Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a king. And Pharaoh threw two people into prison. One was a chief butler. The other was a chief baker. And they had a dream, and they heard that Joseph could interpret dreams, and they asked him and said, explain to me what this dream is that I'm getting. And the chief butler began to tell him his dream, and Joseph said, that's no problem. What that means is you're going to be restored to your old job. Pharaoh's going to come back, and he's going to put you in the same place that you were at before, very soon. And the chief baker said, well, interpret my dream, and all like this. And he told him his dream, and Joseph said, well, you're going to get your head chopped off. Yeah. You're going to die. Both dreams came true. Okay? Both dreams came true. Now, the interesting part about this is if you look in chapter 40, and if you notice Genesis chapter 40, it's on your handouts there. Look at verse number 23. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. Everybody say forgot. Yeah. You see, he said, Joseph asked him, he said, look, all I want you to do is remember me. All I want you to do is when you get out of here, I want you to remember who I am. I want you to remember what I did. Remember I interpreted that dream. Remember what kind of man I am. Please, remember me. Now, if you would, look at chapter 41, verse number 1. And it came to pass at the end of the 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. Now the king, the man that's in charge of everything in Egypt, has a dream. But what I want you to notice, at the end of 2 full years. From that time, the chief butler, and he told, and Joseph said, remember me when you get out of here. It was 2 years that he stayed in prison after that. Now, I just gave you an overview or summary of what had taken place so far. If you look in between there, if you look in the details, there's 2 things I want you to catch here. Okay? Now keep in mind, he was thrown in the pit. He was hated by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was accused of rape that wasn't true. He was cast into prison. Everything he did, there was nothing but lies and things that were against him. But the first thing I want you to keep in mind is Joseph never complained. He never complained, Lord, why does this happen to me? Or I never catch a break in life. This is not right. He never complained. Now remember, we're talking about the age of 17 to probably 31, a 14-year span here when it's all said and done. He never complained. The second thing I want you to notice is he always excelled. You see, when you think about forgiveness is not forgetting, it's moving forward. You see, in order to move forward, you gotta just put aside what has taken place to you in the last 3 quarters. Life has not been fair to you. You may have not catch breaks. You may have been overlooked. You may have ended up in a financial mess. You may have ended up in a family problem. You just got to let it go.
Amen.
If you're going to play in the 4th quarter, you got to move forward. And one thing is, you don't always complain about the past. And the second thing is, you always excel at whatever you're doing. You see, life's not fair. And you're either going to go backwards, you're going to remain stagnant, or you're going to move on. You see, life wasn't fair to Joseph, especially at that age. But he chose to move forward. He chose to do the best he could under the circumstances. He couldn't sit here and bellyache and pity party about times in the past. He had to move forward. Forgiveness is not forgetting, because all during this time you knew he remembered his brothers and what they did. He knew that his brothers hated him. He didn't forget about it, but he just knew he had to move on or move forward. Let me share the second thing with you. Forgiveness is not a fight. It's more like a foundation or building a foundation. Forgiveness is not a fight. It's more like building a foundation. Everything Joseph went through from the ages of 17 to 31 was unfair. He couldn't catch a break in a struggle. Keep in mind, all during this time, he's not seeing his family. Keep in mind, not only that, he totally had to change his culture of living. You see, historically, the men of Israel would wear beards and different type of clothing. Egypt, the Egyptians, where he was at, were clean shaven. They wore a lot of purple. They wore something different. So you could tell just by the outer appearance who was an Egyptian and who was a Hebrew. But not only that, he had to change his language. He had to learn how to speak like the Egyptians. I mean, it wasn't just the idea of bouncing from place to place. It was the idea of having a whole new culture. Like if somebody was to take you and I and say, okay, you're going to spend the rest of your life in the Middle East, it's going to be a culture shock to you and I. We're going to have to change. We're not going to have the same amenities or the same things that we like to do here. It's going to be totally different over there. We're going to have to learn their ways. It doesn't mean we have to change who we are, but it may have to change the outside about how we speak, language we learn, and things like that. It's totally different culture. Think about what you and I would do in the predicament that Joseph would do. I think one thing we would do is we'd get mad at God. I think the first thing we'd do was get mad at God. I mean, we'd say, God, why did you allow this to happen? God, why? Why did you allow this to happen? God, you are King of Kings. You're Lord of Lords. You're sovereign. You're God Almighty. Why did you allow this to happen to me? God, I have served you faithfully. Why? Just keep in mind, God allows things to happen.
Amen.
Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. You know, not only would we probably react as mad at God, we'd probably react to being mad at our families. You know, if it wasn't for them, if it wasn't for my brothers, if it wasn't for their jealousy and their animosity and being vindictive as they were, I wouldn't be in this place. But it's all their fault. And if my dad would have been a bigger man, he would have straightened them out anyway. He would have blamed it on the family. And you know, I think another thing we would have been mad at is the world. You know what? I never catch a break. I think everybody is out to get me. It just seems like I go from place to place. Nothing ever happens good. I think the world is out to get me. I just one of those people where there's a dark cloud over my head. You see, we've got to understand that setbacks is a part of life. Setbacks is where we build the foundation of our lives. When we go through the trials and the tribulations and the tough times and the setbacks, that's where we're building the foundation of who we are. I want you to notice something in chapter 39 and follow me in these 3 verses. Genesis chapter 39, notice verse number 2. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. He was a prosperous man in the house of the master, the Egyptian. Talking about before he was accused of rape. Notice verse number 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prisons. Now if you would, notice verse number 23. And the keeper of the prisons looked not to anything that was under his hand. In other words, when Joseph was in prison, they didn't try to search his bed or search anything, his bags or anything else, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. I want you to notice that every place that Joseph was at, whether it was in slavery, whether it was the head honcho at Potiphar's house, whether it was in prison, the Lord was with him. The Lord caused him to prosper. Every place, people seen the character of Joseph and said, there is something different about him. And he began to prosper. Now, I want you to keep a couple things, or always remember this. Nothing can happen without the Lord's approval. Joseph was in this predicament because God allowed it. Now let me take you back in history a little bit. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and God allowed it to happen. Hitler tried to take over the world and destroy the Jews, and God allowed Hitler to take his course for a while. 9/11, the worst tragedy I have seen in our lifetime. When these terrorists, these nuts, fly into the World Trade Center back in 2001, God allowed that to happen. God had the power to stop it, but He allowed it to happen. Nothing can be done without God allowing it to happen. Another thing to keep in mind is God always has a purpose. He always has a purpose. What do you mean by that? If you go in the book of Job, you find where God is having a conversation with all people, Satan. And He says, look at Job. Man, he is awesome. He's a complete, perfect servant. Satan says, no kid. You gave him money, gave him a family, gave him wealth, gave him home, gave him everything else. You let me slap him around a little bit, lay a little smack down on him, I guarantee you he'll curse you and die. God allowed it to happen. Job went through torture. Job went through misery. They took his kids, they took his home, they took his finances, they took his mutual funds, they took his stocks, his bonds, and everything, and ruined him to where he was sitting in the ashes naked. And later, a lot later, Joseph rebounded, and God blessed him with even more. But God allowed it to happen. The Apostle Paul was one of the meanest, cruelest people before he got saved. And after he got saved, the Christians, the disciples, people were scared of him because of his past reputation. And Jesus told a man by the name of Ananias who was going to baptize him, said, don't be afraid of him, for he is a chosen vessel to me. He said, he is going to suffer many things for my name's sake. The Apostle Paul wrote half of the New Testament, and most of it was from prison. Most of it was from times being beaten, shipwrecked, physically destroyed, mentally challenged, and just so many things that went on after he was saved. God allowed it to happen, but Paul continued to build church after church after church after church. And at the end, he said, I have finished my course. I have fought the good fight. You see, forgiveness is not a fight. Okay? Forgiveness is not a fight. It's more like a building foundation. When you go through the setbacks and you go through the trials and you go through the tough times, hopefully that will build you and I stronger character and stronger people for the Lord. Hopefully it will increase our faith. Joseph here, I think everybody in this room would agree that what happened to him was not fair. But I think everybody would also agree that God allowed it to happen. I think everybody would agree that God had a purpose for it. And I think everybody would agree that in the end, it helped Joseph. Number 3, forgiveness is not failing. It's more like living in freedom. Number 3, forgiveness is not failing. It's more like living in freedom. I want you to notice chapter 45 of Genesis, verses 1 through 5. And Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. And he caused and cried, cause every man to go out from me. And he stood, no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brothers. And he wept out loud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. And Joseph said unto his brothers, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. And he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore, verse number 5, be not grieved nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. When Pharaoh had a dream, the king of Egypt, they called Joseph out of prison, and he said, you're going to go through 7 years where the economy is going to be booming. It's going to be a great time, but then after that, you're going to have 7 years of famine. And he said, you're going to have to stock up. You're going to have to put some things back and prepare for that 7-year famine. And the Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph, the Hebrew. Now keep in mind, the Egyptian was so impressed with the Hebrew. And he said to him, he said, I'm going to put you in charge. And Joseph was really the second man in charge. And when there's a famine that took place, people would come from all over the place, and he would ration food to them. Now here's the unique part of the story. Joseph's brother made several trips to him. They never recognized him. Keep in mind, he dressed different. He was clean shaven. He talked Egyptian. You see, the brothers would have little talks among themselves. And they would talk in Hebrew. And they did not think Joseph, they didn't even know he was Joseph. They didn't think he understood it. He understood every word. And he put him through a series of tests. And then finally, at this moment here, we find where Joseph tells his brother, he begins to identify himself. And he says, I am your brother, Joseph. Notice the first thing on his mind is Daddy still living. Notice the brother's response. It says they could not speak a word. They were just stunned. They were shocked. They just marveled at this. They couldn't say a word. What do you think they were thinking? Uh-oh. He's fixing to have revenge on us. He's fixing to repay us for what we did to him. But notice Joseph spoke up again. And he said, I am your brother. Now watch this, verse number 4. Whom ye sold to me to Egypt. In other words, they couldn't say a word. They probably were thinking he's fixing to repay us for what we did to him. And then he looks at him and says, and I am your brother. Listen to me. I am Joseph, your brother, the one who you sold to the enemy. Imagine the response then. Then Joseph came back. And notice what he said. Don't be upset. Don't be angry. Don't grieve. Don't hurt. Now watch this. For ye sold me, but God has sent you that I may. For God did send me before you to preserve life. Instead of blaming God, he glorified God. And for all the things he's been through for the last 14 years, all the misery, all the dark clouds, he said, brothers, I forgive you. I'm not worried about that because God had a purpose.